Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, welcome to Artist-Based Books and Talks. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's coming into a nice day outside, so we appreciate your presence here. So this afternoon's event occurs as part of Artist-Space's curatorial partnership with the Whitney Biennial 2012. Through to the end of the biennial in late May, Artist-Space has organised a series of events that respond to the work in the exhibition at Whitney and to the nature of the biennial as a whole. Over this weekend, we are holding the first of 3 weekend symposia developed around the core concerns active in the biennial. This weekend's grouping of presentations has been brought together with biennial artist Sam DeWitt under the title MaterialsMoneyCrisis, and centres around questions that he has posed on the relationship between materials of art production and the media of financialisation. I'm going to hand over to Sam shortly to introduce further his thinking around which today's presentations have been gathered. But we're very pleased to be joined this afternoon by artist and writer Melanie Gilligan, researcher and lecturer in philosophy, poetics and technology Nathan Brown, architectural critic and writer Craig Buckley, and lecturer in anthropology and philosophy Benjamin Lee. So the order of today is we're going to begin with a short introduction from Sam, followed by presentations from Melanie and Nathan. We'll take a 20-minute break then and return for presentations from Benjamin Lee and Craig Buckley. And I think that after each speaker has given their presentation, there'll be an opportunity for questions, but we'll try and keep that brief so we can keep moving. So I'm going to just formally introduce our first group of speakers. So Sam DeWitt is an artist based in New York, as I'm sure you all know, whose work is included in Whitney Biennial 2012. He has had recent solo exhibitions at Daniel Buchholz Gallery in Cologne, Miguel Abreu in New York, and Franco Soffiatini in Turin. Melanie Gilligan is an artist and writer based in New York. Her recent episodic video projects, Popular Unrest and Crisis in the Credit System, have been exhibited internationally, including solo projects at Chisenhale Gallery in London and Kunstverein Cologne. She has contributed texts to publications in journals including Grey Room, Texas Kunst and Art Forum. And Nathan Brown is an assistant professor in the Department of English and Program in Critical Theory at the University of California, Davis. His research and teaching focuses on 20th and 21st century poetry and poetics, continental philosophy and science and technology studies. He is currently at work on 2 book projects, The Limits of Fabrication, Material Science and Materialist Poetics, and Absent Blue Wax, Rationalist Empiricism. So I'm going to hand over directly now to Sam to introduce further today's events.
Thanks, Richard. And I just want to say thank you to Artist-Space for making this day a real pleasure to organize. I'm gonna start with by reading a very short text that perhaps was more of a provocation to myself to try and find these themes together, to try and find a way to find these themes together in some way. So each presenter tonight received some form of this text in some state of disarray. So I'm going to read that and then talk for a little bit afterwards, and then So, you have a comment on it. So materials, money, and crisis. Artists try and capture materials as they flow through the system. Paint, plastic, printers, software, hammers, cameras, gestures, JPEGs, words, lists, whatever. Some materials are retrieved unaccountably as if fallen from the sky into an already expanded field, opening like an abyss of possible criteria. Some are retrieved with caveats of necessity, the disciplinary engagements inherited from modernism, travesty, indifference, dispersion, claims of interestingness, a panoply of discursive support systems. A skeptic might proclaim that if all these supports can be shown to be valid, none can have authority. A networks theorist might perceive a potential for new lines of agency for materials conceived as actors in a network, which supposedly dissolves the confused conceptions of monolithic categories in favor of newly found descriptive resources. Whereas a beleaguered melancholic might be heard to lament the foreclosure of critical negativity when old taboos seem to have become irrelevant for many artists. Despite the sometimes clarity offered by work done from these positions, one might want to begin by asserting that the now commonplace expansion and homogenization of material resources and media perhaps corresponds to something fundamental to the capitalist crises that serve as its historical backdrop. Georg Lukács writes during a much earlier period of mass crisis, in periods when capitalism functions in a so-called normal manner and its various processes appear autonomous, people living within capitalist society think and experience it as unitary. Whereas in periods of crisis, when the autonomous elements are drawn together into a unity, they experience it as disintegration. Indeed, the contemporary consolidation of the corporate state and a decadent global financial system, defended by the expanded powers of the military and police, historically seems to correspond to an artistic culture that feels at home in an amorphous and apparently not hierarchical field of tools, conceptual strategies, technical processes, etc., all of which count in the institutional definition and material structure of artworks. The field appears particularly disintegrated. Old debates surrounding postmodernism focused on the cultural breakdown of historical narrative and the dissolution of its developmental logic, issuing into a stalemate of pluralized strategies and historically untethered aesthetic resources. Artists born from the mid-70s on, during the rise of neoliberal speculative capital, mostly came to consciousness after these debates had reached a point of terminal entropy, becoming the stuff of professionalized art school curriculum. Interestingly, questions surrounding the mobility of the sign, a symbolic economy often seen as coeval with floating prices, seems today to be totally subsumed after institutional critique, gigantic wall-hung digital photography, and relational aesthetics by a return to assemblage aesthetics and flatbed picture planes. In the present, when speculative capital has reached a stage of quickening cyclical crises, it might then not be so far-fetched to ask, what are the mediations that bind the fact that while asset managers were busy dematerializing the object of investment, structuring it away from productive economies into a process of spreading risk across their portfolios, many artists born during the same period seem to be busy adding materials to theirs. While this question may remain entirely rhetorical in its current formulation, asking after what resources help us conceptualize the perhaps unexpected ways in which the constellation of materials, money, and prices hang together may provide a basis for thinking limits and possibilities for artistic practice in the present. So what of money? Most materials cost money, a seeming mega or meta-material if there ever was one. Art's naked relation to capital bears the matter out, certainly as an investment opportunity for a core of financial elite, but perhaps also on a more speculative epistemological level. Georg Simmel articulates the structure of monetary equivalence with that of aesthetic judgment itself in his philosophy of money. He writes, the strange coalescing abstraction and anticipation of ownership of property, which constitutes the meaning of money, is like aesthetic pleasure in permitting consciousness a free play, a portentous extension into an unresisting medium and the incorporation of all possibilities without violation or deterioration by reality. The cost of art materials, then, begs the question of the materiality of cost itself, its very sensibility. This poses, I think, a peculiar dilemma. For at the same time that money purchases materials, its value provides a model for dematerialization. Exchange value invisibly structures a strictly conceptual relation between materials. It establishes equivalences between wholly different orders of physical existence and use, none of which contain its price. Marx writes, "So far no chemist has ever discovered exchange value, either in a pearl or a diamond." But money's vanishing act seems to realize something peculiar and specific to the value that it at once represents and gives account. With the financialization of capital, money becomes circumscribed by information concerning the circulation of value. Prices refer strictly to wagers on future prices. Exchange value is freed from any even illusory associations with perceptible material qualities. When money flows through a financial system composed of pure media, algorithms and information technologies emancipate the materiality of cost from any reference to physical property, unleashing the temporality of capital's idealized circulatory system. Exchange value tends toward its pure state as the idea that circulates through the system. This is something that is realized rather than perverted by finance capital. Production materials are thus left to a contingent logistical future. Finance commences invisibly matching and betting against complex contracts that hedge technical processes and obsolescence, raw matter and poisonous waste, final products and food shortages, promises of payment, their derivatives, speculations in the art market, etc. The geography of global volatility continues to expand, even as value contracts to its idea and the paid labor force shrinks. Perhaps this modulation of expansion and shrinkage allows us to generate different forms of material equivalence other than those given advertising space for marketing. For instance, what are the ties that bind the multitude of fingertips stimulating tactile touchscreens in New York with the neurotoxin-numbed, nerve-damaged hands that come from cleaning agents used on production lines in Shenzhen? How might we think the material structure of the interface here as a heuristic device for something like a geoconceptual contraction of production, circulation, and consumption? The German playwright Bertolt Brecht, in an early note on an attempt to understand and research the proper way to represent the wheat exchange on the stock market as material for an unfinished production, writes, "I thought I would be able to acquire information concerning Chicago's wheat exchange quickly by making a few inquiries of specialists and practitioners. It happened otherwise. No one, neither well-known writers on economics nor business people, no one could explain the process of wheat exchange to me adequately. I won the impression that these processes were simply inexplicable, not to be grasped by reason, i.e. unreasonable. This grain market was one big swamp." One wonders what he would have thought of someone trying to explain what a derivative was. The stock market becomes an unreasonable material to work with, save for metaphors of liquidity, whether of a stagnant or a fluid variety, and by extension of evaporation. Here the questions start to flow. What other lexicons enable us to give consistency to processes seemingly too complex and cruel for adequate representation? What does this imply for defining a materialist art practice? Can art eschew facile representational conventions while still critically treating in some way the social imaginary that surrounds its material foundations? What forms of perceptual experience can art mobilize in opposition to the accelerated time of capital's destructive and self-perpetuating data streams, for instance, to matched microsecond financial hedging or so-called high-frequency trading, which automates the trade of risk on a massive and now a temporally imperceptible scale. And why would an artist even think to do so in the first place? Further, what meaning does the effective free play of the faculties in modern theories of aesthetic experience signify after the advent of proprietary algorithms used to track and predict affects transmitted over communications technologies? Or as the executive of London-based Derwent Capital Markets, which is a boutique hedge fund in London that does social media sentiment trading, which is essentially just tracking like moods on Twitter. As he writes, "We've never before had the technology or the data to be able to quantify human emotion. This is the fourth dimension." Might turning to an examination of the instruments, physical supports, and organizational structures allow us to capture these flows, even fleetingly, in order to cast them in a light that reveals and exploits an aspect riven by contradiction and crisis? Or does this suggest a mere fetish for the contingent perceptible qualities of media? Artists, just like everyone else it seems, are materials that flow through a system that has them captured, which begs the question as to what might be mobilized for the construction of new eddies and countercurrents. So that's some form of that is what went out to everybody who's going to present today as provocation, set of confusion, as call it what you want. This image here, speaking of metaphors of liquidity, this weird helix thing here. This image comes from, it's actually a business card that was given to me by the head of security at the New York Stock Exchange, Euronext. Not the building on Broad Street, not from the building on Broad Street, but from a building in Mahwah, New Jersey, speaking of high-frequency trading, which is, it's essentially, it's the stock exchange. It's where trades happen. What the building is an enormous server farm that houses what are called matching engines. What these things do is, in the space of microseconds, these matching engines execute buy and sell orders in the space of microseconds. And they do so through sort of self-teaching algorithms. So essentially, like in the space of a microsecond, this algorithm will take sort of the price of tin, the price of the German stock exchange, price of gold, et cetera, it'll map where they are and then buy or sell based on previous data. And to give you a sense of how fast a microsecond is, the human sensorium can react to events at the very minimum at something like 140 milliseconds. So, and that's a very simple stimulus. So this is like really very, very fast, imperceptible by the human sensorium. So anyway, I was interested in this stuff. I was doing some research on it, and it's kind of an open secret that this place exists because you can find the address online. So I drove out there. I drove to Mahwah, New Jersey, to take a photograph of the building, thinking perhaps I'd just be turned away. And instead, to make a very long story short, I was detained for about 2 hours by a group of security agents and the New Jersey State Police, including a lieutenant. My car was forcibly searched, and all the photographs I had taken, they made me erase the photographs, all of which is supposed to be illegal, but under the banner of the Patriot Act, they can do anything they want. They have extraordinary powers. So, subsequently, I was visited in my home actually by 2 JTTF, or Joint Terrorist Task Force officers, who went through my bookshelves and were disgusted to learn I was an artist. So anyway, I've been trying to sort of write a dialogue that serves as something like a translation of this event. And I thought to actually enlist a friend of mine to do the dialogue here, but I'm just a terrible performer. So instead, I engaged in some real, like, customized mass cultural therapy and made a video for you to watch.
Stop. I am cogitating. I say I am the security of this place and you are an unknown narrative. We need your information.
I am trying to record an image of this building to think on. I too want some information. I am looking to think.
Don't look to think on this building. This building is to be secured by subtracting thinking from looking. Tell us what you know about this building.
I know that this building houses servers through which algorithms execute the majority of trades on the world's stock market at the speed of microseconds.
This building is too much information for you to think about already. It does not need or want your thinking. That is all that happens here, the constant flow of information. And you knowing this and being here is inherent to our nervous system. Your rights at looking and thinking are henceforth suspended. Here is my card. I exchange this for more information. Who are you?
I suppose I am a bad citizen. Who else would you speak to in such a way?
Bad citizen. Do not look to think. We demanded more information about what you're doing here.
I am looking for material.
There is no material here but this fleshy security agents.
But what of the brick of this building? Its cooling system? The plants and stones? The optical cables? The security cameras? And what of the information running through this building? The electricity bill?
You are not permitted to look to think about this building. You are not allowed to have its image stored on your digital recording device. Thinking is for the algorithms to do. They are better at it than you.
And what do I risk by looking to think?
First, use your imagination and think about punishment by the state and its police. Second, imagine we are looking to think of you with our own digital recording devices wherever you feel free. Finally, and most importantly, imagine you cannot even imagine that. You risk everything that you cannot imagine. This is how we maintain control over your agitated nervous system without you being cognizant of it. This is how you make yourself a good citizen.
This makes me fearful.
Don't think about it. The market will do that for you. The markets matched by the servers that I secure have taken that into account by monitoring your and everyone else's habits and information on all your digital recording devices.
But my recording device that I hold in my hand, for example, tells me nothing about any of the connections that make this site what it is. What of political contingencies? What of the price of labor in Sri Lanka? What of the price of tin? Of gold? What of the German stock exchange? The yen? What of the price of price? What I record on this device is the invisibility of the meaning of this building. I am here to collect material on the senselessness of this site. You are helping me to feel this through intimidation.
The markets trade on our feelings before you can say the words, I am. Your optical recording device cannot tell you about those feelings unless you write or speak about them into other recording devices. It is clear that this building is too much information for you. Let your agitated nervous system express itself in looking to think about other things. Be self-motivated. Watch pornography. Start a blog. There is nothing here for you.
So what are you and the police securing exactly?
The police protect risk that good citizens must bear. The police protect the financial elite and their property. The police protect the volatility of the market and its power to bankrupt the world and destroy lives. The police protect the right of the market to think and destroy. I serve the servers. I secure securitization. I am the flesh of risk. I am the smoldering gate before the frozen wasteland of abstraction. I am the barricade that burns to the touch and blinds those looking to think. Under threat of imprisonment and whatever else you cannot imagine, you must now erase your digital optical recording device.
He said device, but that's it. I like the extra normal with that Lukács quote about the normal functioning of capitalism. Anyway, so I'm really very pleased that everyone who is going to speak today agreed to do so, because I have enormous admiration for all of their work. And I guess on that note, I will introduce Melanie Gilligan.
see that yet. So, I'm Melanie. What I'm going to try to do today is approach my work in a different way. So basically, I'm not going to really go into what I do. You'll probably just be able to pick it up as you go along if you don't know my work. Yeah, I make these films that have a lot of information in them about finance, about politics, whatever you call it, and that information is immersed in in the narrative. And so what I proposed to Sam was something that I've been wanting to do for a while. Does it sound too loud, you guys, or is it okay? Yeah? Yeah? I'll let the sound guy deal with that. Okay. And so, yeah, and so what I've been wanting to do for a while is, the films have to stand on their own. As they say, as they tell you when you're making films, you're not supposed to say it, you're supposed to show things through action, rather than putting it in dialogue. And I always kind of put stuff in dialogue, at least when I first started working on making narrative-like kind of films. And so I wanted to actually do the explanation as well. And so I started having this idea that I would make a kind of like a DVD extra director's commentary, like you can turn on this extra feature on the DVD and get the director talking about like what happened during the shoot or other things. So I was telling Sam I wanted to do that, but with all of the Marxian analysis, all of the background meaning to do with the financial crisis. So that's what I'm going to do today, kind of. It's going to be a little bit technically awkward at points, so you're going to have to bear with me. There'll be pauses in the videos at moments when you're getting into it and all sorts of things. Sound will be weird, but just bear with me. Yeah, okay, so this first film is called Crisis in the Credit System. And it's a film I made about the financial crisis. I made it back in, it came out in October 2008. I was working on it from 2007 to 2008. And I'm just going to start by showing you a clip that drops you into the film. This woman you see here, she's the head, she's basically she's working with a bunch of investment bank employees to do a brainstorming session, a role-playing session, out at a kind of outdoor retreat, all very luxurious and whatnot. And so she's pushing them to use their imagination, come up with ways to think their way out of the crisis, basically come up with solutions, better ways of profiting from the crisis. And so I'll show you that, and then I'll start my DVD commentary. Okay, so she's about to ask one of the employees to kind of show her his stuff, go for it, do your thing.
Back during the Wall Street boom before the Great Depression, everyone was superstitious. They had to be. They couldn't offset risk the way we can today. Anyway, one ritual among the investors was to visit Lady Luck, a renowned prostitute. At the height of the boom, thousands were seeing her. Lady Luck could make a man see the future. Spend the night with her and you'd be charmed. If you lost big, they said you hadn't been to see Lady Luck enough. She was obsessed with gambling and chance. She found luck and fate to turn on. Then, at the height of her popularity, she revealed she had syphilis, and that she was going insane from it. There was a good chance she'd spread it through all of Wall Street. The next morning saw a frenzy of selling. That's the real story behind the Great Depression. The one thing an investor doesn't want to know is how connected everything is.
Who's Lady Luck now?
Subprime. We've always had the stick of poverty on it. Trade extract from AAAs. This looks
Storehouse's old saying, all poverty is contagious. Fed starts acting like a fool in the shower. Now the water's scalding. Anyone notice Rome is burning? Wake up, people.
Crisis in the credit system. I found a bubble inside the crisis. A hole full of empty mess. Crisis in the credit system.
So what's happening here is you have like I've basically set up this war between this guy, private equity head, a kind of private equity CEO, and as you're about to see, some hedge fund managers. To give you a very basic idea, like the kind of role of hedge fund managers are kind of like the new finance, which I'll go into soon, but the private equity guy kind of represents almost like the private equity is kind of like they were preparing the ground in a lot of ways for the new finance that was about to evolve. They started in the 80s. But basically, new finance, my way of looking at this, or actually a lot of people's, was like basically like the turn that started to happen from the 80s and 90s onwards into what eventually developed into the financial crisis. And what differentiated new finance, or what made it special and new, was basically a kind of like something that developed at an environment of low interest rates, a deregulated financial system that was basically being deregulated across the world, but especially in the US. And like a general movement away from the old and safe behavior that had characterized banking up until the 90s. And also, very famously, as everyone knows, a dependence on higher proportions of leverage, like starting to do trades from huge amounts of debt. Leverage is another way of saying credit or debt, borrowing. So those are some of the conditions that typified this era, or this period that is what we're living in now still, as a financial system kind of continues to plug on despite so many efforts to regulate and slow it down. Not that I'm saying it has to be done. So now I'll show you the hedge fund managers. Penelope, let's hear your role.
I'm a hedge fund manager.
Bagel Capital Management, can I help?
Thanks for lending me your jet. When do you want it back?
No hurry, I've got others. Which horse is there?
Soft Viagra first. You want it?
No. Right, look. If it's known it can be better, if it can be better, it's already useless. So only bring me that which cannot be bet on before it's known. Mortals and totally incompetent.
Okay. Alpha topic, Weathering the Bad Times, part 30. Let's throw some ideas at the wall, see what sticks.
Right. Food prices tripling over 5 months. This must have created some opportunities we haven't tried yet.
All right. Shortage, poverty, hunger, weight loss. Short large clothing manufacturers and go long on companies making smaller sizes. Short Weight Watchers, the major gyms and scale manufacturers.
Okay, fine. The bigger picture. Probable outcome, staple foods too expensive for too long. They become luxuries in ways unimaginable since World War II. Fat becomes the new thin and fashionable again.
Fat?
Or at least healthily chubby. So, long-term plan, 1, short fat first and go long on thin. 2, later go long on fat. So when fat's down, we can buy fat cheap. Meanwhile, go short on thin. So when fat comes back up, we'll be flush.
Or flesh. Fat will come from a thin market, how depressing. Who'd have thought the credit crisis would be so devastating?
Penelope, when finance dies, the world's good.
Okay, so I think probably most people are familiar with the idea of shorting, right? So I don't really need to go into that, but obviously the film is already doing a lot of explanation itself. But I just want to add a couple things. The way I basically see the overgrowth of finance that happened in that period, 90s 80s, 90s, 2000s, and now, is basically it's a way that capitalism has been able to forestall its crisis of value, which developed in the 70s and, well, has been developing for an extremely long time, but actually reached a kind of crisis point in the 70s. But as most of you would have heard, certain kind of structural changes happened in the world of finance and started to make this present moment possible. So in a way, the private equity guy kind of heralds this new type of change. And then there's a lot of other things going on in this conversation that I want to touch on really quickly. So she, the woman hedge fund manager, is saying we can't trade debt anymore. And she's also saying, she's saying we can't trade debt anymore. So we have to start trading on or betting on the market's own mood and its own logic, or like what's happening in the market itself. And this is something that you saw at the time of the financial crisis really hitting home, but at the same time you still see it now increasingly. I mean, it's always been a factor, but increasingly you see this tendency to bet on itself. I'm gonna read from my paper for a little while so I can go into detail about this. Okay, so Babel, this hedge fund, invents a derivative for speculating on investor sentiment, the most powerful gauge of market feeling ever invented. You find out in another scene. Finance turns inward, increasingly profiting from speculating on the outcomes produced by its own dynamics, i.e. the ups and downs in markets prompted by fearful selling flurries or bullion stampedes to buy. This was the case before the crisis, but we've seen this a great deal since the beginning of the crisis especially. The topic of market feeling and sentiment has continually reappeared and transformed several times since the crisis began. In 2008, many commentators repeated the notion that markets are all about trust. In other words, they were applying the old capitalist platitude that markets are all about consumer confidence and demand. That at base, it's the market and not labor put into a commodity that decides the price. Now, just as an aside, from Marx's own point of view, I generally, in my work, am pretty influenced by Marxist thinking. In Marx's own writing, he actually typifies this particular type of view, this kind of market relativist view, by his own critique of the economist Samuel Bailey in his time. So he had a critique of Bailey, but actually in Marx's own thinking, he moved from having a concept of value that at first was similar to David Ricardo, another economist, labor theory of value, to his own very different concept of value through taking on board aspects of Bailey's understanding. Marx defined value as determined by the labor power that goes into it, but this is in turn influenced by social conditions that produce it. Hence, Marx's repetitive emphasis in Capital, when he's writing about value, that value is a result of the socially necessary labor put into a commodity. So it's actually the socially necessary, the kind of like social context, in a way, of what is affecting, let's say, the cost of labor at the time, of what's affecting, someone's ability to reproduce their living standards. These sorts of things actually end up affecting the socially necessary labor time in a commodity has to be put into a commodity. So anyway, that was just an aside, but a long one. So just going back to this idea of investor sentiment, that's become incredibly crucial at the moment, like in the last 2 years, watching the Euro crisis develop. Market sentiment is increasingly become a tyrannical dictator that allows countries to stand or fall. This increasingly has developed as the Euro crisis keeps returning, collapsing nations and ousting politicians in countries like Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Italy, and Spain. Forced by markets and international financial organizations to implement austerity measures as a means of cutting their deficits, and even more disturbingly, to suppress protesting populations battling against these measures. In the past few years of crisis, the roles of governments and financial markets have actually appeared to merge as financial markets increasingly affect social policy. A couple examples of this is in November of 2011, the financial markets actually effectively managed to oust Prime Minister Berlusconi in Italy, and an event that was followed by an urgent scramble to put a new government in place before the opening of the markets the next business day. Also in November, the Financial Times published a striking headline, "Rajoy begs for more than half an hour," which was referring to a Spanish conservative leader who was asking the market for more time, basically, like during a kind of, cabinet shift or switch. Individual investors expand their own capital by looking for looming crises as opportunities. Investors ostensibly afraid of the risk of buying a nation's bonds and therefore demanding a higher return on the national debt they're holding. Sorry, I have a cold and my voice is going a bit weird. Anyway, so investors are participating in a common practice of making money today to ride the waves of fear in the markets in order to buy low and sell high. In my work, I argue that capital is a social body because it develops... Oh, no, I'm not going to go into that. Okay, so... Sorry, a lot of notes. Okay, I'm going to continue showing you some slides. Wait. I turned down the sound so I could talk, and then I just... Here we go. So this is when they start to scheme about this new derivative they created.
With today's systemic trust issues, the only way to turn a profit is to capture that distrust. Since we can't trade debt anymore, we better harness what the market thinks of itself, because there's not much else to bet on.
Well, what about fundamentals, the true value companies, that kind of thing?
Fundamentals, they don't exist. The market decides them.
But everyone's already betting on the market move.
That's why I've come up with a totally unprecedented way of harnessing the market's sentiment to come up with this.
So this is basically like what I was saying about market mood and all of that. I intended to say here. So this is another scene in the film. It's about a trader who basically kind of connects with the market very deeply and then predicts through trances, a kind of Delphic sort of. His company is called Delphi Capital Management, and he basically just goes into this zone.
Analyst. He is in a trance, subconsciously absorbing information and issuing predictions.
Tomorrow, Brent crude 145.23, aluminium 2973.25, and the dead turn a profit in graves of air. Take 1.5. 7.34% spread. The mind is an incredible computational and trend forecasting system. Most people think the brain is slower than a computer, but that's just the conscious mind. Actually, the unconscious is the most powerful network processor known to man. A trader's gut feeling is really a subconscious analysis of very subtle data information. The brain.
A team of cryptologists work on the oracle's predictions. Then they are sent out to nearly 250,000 private subscribers.
Sometimes I see my visions in 3 screens, sometimes in order of probability, sometimes by asset class, or in the best order of execution with recommendations for starts and stops.
This is on to another scene in the film that actually kind of touches on some subjects that Sam raised in his introduction.
Okay, the identity of an asset is unimportant. Euros, dollars, yen, grain, pork bellies, stocks, energy, it's all the same. What matters is the price. and how one market price relates to another. So if we create a new financial instrument from an asset, say a derivative, the price becomes not only independent of its original context, but totally abstracted from it. So
what we need is a new spoken language where words perform the same function without any connection to any particular thing. So if I use the word jet, I can substitute other words for the word jet. I can use the word tree, but it wouldn't mean tree, it would mean jet. And suddenly we have expanded our word-generating profit margin exponentially, and we can take profit from more meanings and numerous positions on it.
Okay, so a new higher returns language for new finance. This would start with a small group of people in the know. Hedge fund managers. It would be a system that references itself, relying entirely on insider knowledge and always relating back to itself. They'd very rapidly develop new terms for the deals and events that they all know about, but these would very quickly get old and tired for these information-hungry hedge fund managers.
Oh, right, so it might be something like Malchior meets Morgan Stanley bloodshed in liquidity dip. BlackRock Trepanning rally has legs the Nordica Vista Love Comatech Triangle.
Renminbi Dabblers eat yachts and yachts for Superfund. Troy Zenith Showdown lives liquid.
But maybe language in a credit crisis should be one of contraction. So that instead of credit risk, you've got crisp, and instead of shares and bonds, you've got Johns and Bears.
Expansion.
So, as they said, the identity of an asset is unimportant. Stock, pork bellies, it's all the same. Something that I developed actually in the other film I'm going to show you, Popular Unrest. The derivative, the financial instrument that Sam was referring to, and that I think is probably going to be talked about more during today, is a way of investing in an asset without actually purchasing the things in which you're investing. So derivatives abstract the relation to an asset in such a way that today's investors can invest in and compare the rates of return on any tradable commodity, no matter how diverse, be it service work, factory labor, food, oil, metals, real estate, or currencies, and demand that they're competitive in comparison with one another. As a result, each person's labor, wherever he or she is in the global nexus of accumulation, is increasingly subject to pressures to render his or her labor competitively profitable, e.g. work for decreased wages and increased productivity. Keep going. This scene is when the future predicting trader starts to have this kind of illusion pierced by the actual effect that the financial crisis is having on the
8%
real
inflation,
economy.
highest level for 11 years, almost double the Bank of England's target. Experts warn tonight it could even reach 5% before the end of the year.
the credit crisis is affecting us all. We must all practice austerity. It is critical that wages must remain the same or go down. Any sign that higher inflation is pushing up pay significantly must be controlled, 765.38, to prevent a damaging wage price spiral. JP Morgan, the labour market is a sinking ship, highest unemployment for decades, falling standard of living. Alan Greenspan, there's no bottom in sight. The crisis is an expression of underlying debt, borrowing, no production, looting what's left of our resources, reducing what society needs. The market, whatever it wants. When the staff of life is wriggling digit, when necessities are only ours through the market, when all is falling except those at the top, then the richest will find the weakest most valuable. Debts collapsing, wage cuts, layoffs, unemployment, bankruptcy, recession tendencies, homelessness, dollar plummets, poverty, food riots, inflation, starvation, hardship, rising cost of living, fuel strikes, fuel riots, fuel wars.
So yeah, I was making this back in 2008, but it was obvious what, at that point, what a financial crisis would do, the sort of austerity measures it would bring with it. And so I guess that part is really just a commentary on what would happen, and also just like the entire dependence of our society and all of its running, all the kind of ability to survive that's dependent on the financial economy. So I also toward the end of this film, I start kind of pushing it more and more towards my own interpretation and critique. Now I do that through, like, basically the narrative is crumbling in a lot of ways, and the illusion that these investment bankers are trying to create for their boss is actually falling apart. And so it starts to break up into what in the kind of corporate world they would call breakout sessions in a kind of corporate role-playing or brainstorming session. And that's what these next scenes are. Basically, in the two scenes, one of them I'm looking at basically looking at the idea of techno-depreciation, and in the other one I'm looking at the idea of money.
Well, what's money like?
It's really not like a thing.
True, it is always changing.
There's something evolving, a dynamic process. Life on Earth, evolving in stages. Money is a single-cell organism in primordial goo. And then it develops basic needs. It eats, it grows, it reproduces.
It's like a fish. And then it grows legs. And now it's on land. Crawling, scurrying, trotting. And always reproducing until it becomes more complex. And then finally it becomes sentient.
So it evolves in great leaps until suddenly it's walking upright, a creature conscious of its own existence. And then what does it do?
It starts thinking about managing its own growth and consciously engineers its expansion. And then one day it says, I think, therefore I am. And it grows bigger and more powerful, and this self-understanding makes it invest in itself, trade in itself, buy itself, loan itself, make IOUs to itself, trade those IOUs as if it were itself, always expanding in any way it can imagine, and considering nothing but itself.
But although it's getting bigger and bigger, it forgets to reproduce itself. It spreads, it sprawls, it grows obese, but it fails to mate until one day it realises it hasn't reproduced at all. It's gargantuan, but completely sterile.
Okay. So in that scene, it's basically like, how do I put this? So I'm looking at the idea that money, money basically, this thing that evolves out of human need for a kind of third term through which to make one commodity and another commodity have a kind of value that can relate them to each other, and through that you get this thing that kind of like grows and starts to kind of have its own logic and basically see through its own desires. Like Marx talks about this basically value. As things evolve in capitalist accumulation, value starts to kind of acquire its own subjective character, and in a way that's what this is about. And I'll start to talk about that again when I show you Popular Unrest.
So once upon a time, technology was just a simple machine. It grew up serving people, taking in simple inputs and producing simple outputs.
So these guys were given the topic of technology to brainstorm on.
That gave them comfort and assistance in their daily lives. The machine helped them run their lives so well that people wanted more help. They asked it to feed them, warm them, clothe them, transport them, educate them. They became reliant on the machine. They started to shape their lives around it and dedicated their work to feeding in inputs and distributing outputs. In fact, they organised their whole society around it. But the machine became so efficient, it needed the people less and less. It began to produce more and more than the people could use, more than they could sell. Rejoice, they said, soon there'll be enough for everyone. But there was a problem. The people forgot that if the machine didn't need them, society didn't need them either. The people who had made the machine grew afraid what if the machine didn't need them, so they began to appease the machine. They began to feed it the things that they had made and to feed it the people who had made it. Yes, so the world became divided between people who were feeding the machine and people who were being fed to it, and the machine became insatiable, and the more you fed it, the more it ate.
Until one day they fed the machine to itself and they all died happily ever after.
So obviously there I'm starting to touch on the fact that the cannibalism of capital, of its tendency to kind of drive things to a breaking point or a kind of stark antagonism between the needs of capital and the needs of the people that capital kind of supports or reproduces. And so, yeah, what's described as like the machine eating these people. But is also a commentary on what I'll talk about later as techno-depreciation, which is kind of tendency in capital that ultimately actually makes that antagonism. It's driving labor out of the production process. I'll go into that.
Great, that was really productive. Okay, I'd like to go back to Evergate. Whatever happens to Ian Newman? Is he still in his coma, and are Babel Capital still profiting at his misfortune? Sell Evergate.
Sell Evergate. Sell Evergate.
Bring it down to Evergate.
Riveted friends and a short shrift for enemies. The loser of the shell game will spread the plague of indices. The fast forward trade will make your own woes mobility.
Eureka!
We have to keep feeding the machine so we can feed the people that the machine keeps feeding.
So we bought the Italian National Grid and we're holding on to it.
So yeah, they're sitting down having a meal together. It's because the eureka moment that this private equity guy just had, was that he'll actually invest in the derivative that the hedge fund managers have invented, thus being able to profit from the crisis of his own company that's being created by the fact that he's ill right now and, about to die, and in a coma, actually, is what that was about. And so, hence the kind of cyclical and recursive nature of finance capital at the moment. The film, if you want to watch it, it's online. It was actually just put online rather than shown in galleries when I made it. And that's it for that film. So I'm going to show another film, which is Popular Unrest, which is a film I made more recently in 2010. Okay.
Panicked onlookers who can't believe their eyes.
The body count is rising all over the world. The murders happen in public, but not one witness has seen a killer.
The killings are happening every day. Eyewitnesses are present at most of the murders. They saw a stabbing instrument attacking from above, but they could not identify it.
But nothing's even happened yet. I just lost the job. Can't they wait another week?
I've got it up on the screen now, sir. Many of your market indicators are low, though you're good on your energy and output profile, part-time schemes and home labour scores. The Spirit has to give you a double C rating, but it could be worse.
So what does that mean? I'm not allowed to play football, have sex then?
Once you're in the red, the Spirit starts looking after your interests. to maximize the purchasing power of your physical activity. But the energy measures you mentioned are only for very specific cases.
I hit all sorts of stories.
You can always buy an extension if you want to, put off the probationary period.
And how much will that cost?
Basically, that's a title sequence. Popular Unrest is a film that is basically looking at the political landscape that we're in after the crisis and trying to think about what sort of political obstacles are facing political collective action, solidarity. Obviously, I was making this film in 2010 before the Arab Spring, before Occupy Wall Street, before a hell of a lot of things, and so I was looking actually at what seemed at that moment, I was like asking myself, well, why isn't there more kind of anger and just resistance to the sort of policies that are starting to come through after the crisis? But then a lot of those policies hadn't actually fully, they hadn't actually come through entirely, or really their results hadn't fully been seen yet. So anyway, Popular Unrest is a film about social reproduction. What I mean by that is capital needs people to work to reproduce its existence, and then capital in turn reproduces people. And capital needs to constantly reproduce itself by self-expanding and self-valorizing. Capital must reproduce labor power to the extent that is socially necessary in order for production to go ahead. In most instances, it does this through the wage, but in addition, at certain Keynesian moments, this has also included the cost of education, healthcare, and buffering against the inevitable unemployment produced by capitalist mode of production. Individual capitals pay workers' wages, as we all know. In some instances, this, basically, I'm looking at those sorts of things, but in a kind of, the film goes on to introduce one kind of all-encompassing sentient character, which is the spirit. In a way, it's a very clunky metaphor for capital itself. And the spirit is a kind of hybrid of government and capital, government and business. I'll show you that. This is a character goes and has a television on, and this is an advertisement that comes on.
How? How can I stop the world spirit?
You can't stop the spirit. It's everywhere, everyone, everything. No one controls it. It doesn't control you. It's merely the sum total of all interactions between everyone on Earth doing exactly what they please every day. All the spirit does is count.
But we need to overthrow the system.
Fine, here.
What's this for?
Stop the spirit. How?
It's kinda complicated. Why not read up on www.worldspirit.gov.com? The spirit. Who's counting? We are.
Kind of got a couple laughs there. What this commercial is basically trying to sum up is the problem that faces everyone today, which is, there's anger, there's frustration, but capital is not in a particular place. It isn't the responsibility of particular people. The commercial is kind of saying like, well, it's reproducing or creating your ability to survive. Why don't you just shoot yourself? Like if you're so gung ho on stopping capitalism, So in a way, in the film, the spirit itself is cognizant and ironically mimicking the activist mentality of like, I want to stop the system. And it's precisely because of the complexity of the problem that sort of ambivalence about the idea of protesting or dissenting can, that becomes a kind of, well, what the fuck are you going to do about it? Like, sorry. And then there's some, so anyway, so that's what the commercial is about. And just move a little faster. I'm not sure if I'm going to go into this part because I'm not sure how much time I have. There's one character that I create in the film that's basically like a kind of emotional fall guy, or how would you tell them exactly? But I think I'm going to pass through this because I know that I might be running out of time.
Penalty.
Sorry, I just wandered in.
Us too.
Experts are baffled by the groupings. Why do they all feel the same unusual, previously normal people abandon their families to join
Many of the people in these groups are among London's fast-growing poor.
Becoming soulmates with people from the underclass when they were never normally mates.
Economic growth. When huge groups like this show up all at once, we don't know what to do with all of them. How do you go to work, raise a family, when you spend all your time with 50 people?
For a while, we were very interesting.
Much has changed in these uncertain times. Another strange phenomenon has been happening around the world this year, but it's only starting to be recognized. They're calling them groupings, and they're happening with greater and greater frequency.
It's not like I'm not an individual. I have more individual concerns and responsibilities than ever before. A car loan, a mortgage. I just suddenly felt as though I was apart.
Apart? You mean isolated? Atomized?
No, like a part. Like a piece of the whole. An aspect, an attribute. I didn't know what it was I was a part of. That's how I felt.
Peter is a part of a small grouping, one of a great number that have recently sprung up in London, but they're happening everywhere across the UK and the rest of the world. Group members' ages and backgrounds vary remarkably. They have little in common and show no sign of prior knowledge of each other. However, they always describe coming together in the same way.
Okay, so
Spirit asks, what is the market value?
basically the group, they explore what it is that's drawing them to one another, but eventually they get approached by these scientists who just tell them actually it's the spirit that's drawing you together. It's totally systemic reasons for you
Gives a beautiful
to have
answer.
these feelings.
As each and every one of us goes through life in all its complexity,
Feelings, thoughts, loves, hates.
pursuing our needs and desires, the spirit is aware and learning from our actions.
These are our micro-stories, where we try to achieve our goals. I want some food.
I want some too.
Sometimes we come into conflict, but...
It's the spirit's job to understand each of our stories in all its minute detail,
and fit it together with the stories of everyone else.
weaving together the threads into one worldwide macro story that's forever changing.
So that we can all coordinate into a synchronous dance of life.
It's always watching, mapping and analysing.
What does this have to do with us? Well, every once in a while, as the spirit is calculating, it has a kind of seizure where it freezes.
But just for a minute fraction of a second.
A stalling, with no effect that we can see. Well, that is until now.
And what's the effect?
To put it simply, your group exactly reproduces a section of the network connections mapped out by the spirit.
So yeah, there's other parts after this where basically the scientists start to run the group through kind of emotional hurdles to learn about the, basically like kind of scientifically get a measure on the emotions and affects of these people. Not just to, like they say, it's to understand what their connection is and how they're connected to the spirit, but actually, as you find out later on in the film, there's another much more kind of interesting reason behind what they're doing.
Sink into the thermal imprint of one of our hygienic bed warming menials. Real human warmth.
Confidence, excitement, challenge. Do you have the social assets to be an insurance? Check your availability.
One thing that runs throughout this film is, well, two things. In the background, you hear little details all the time about the extremely high rate of unemployment in this future place. And at the same time, the tendency to have servants, what they call menials in the film, which has to do with basically this situation I'm talking about, where capitalism, kind of capital's reproduction, its needs in order to expand and continue to make profit, are becoming kind of in more and more intense antagonism and conflict with people's own reproduction, like the reproduction of their lives. You know, their wages, they're increasing, always being pushed down. People are always being put into kind of temporary or part-time work. And earlier on in the film, you hear that basically there's a kind of 60% unemployment in the UK. So this thing about the insurance is basically about, in a way, like this idea that a person would become collateral, like the logic of debt has penetrated to everything to undermine even the sense of the sovereign individual. Everything's up for grabs for the logic of borrowing against value, credit rating, and returns. And I kind of make it look like an abbreviated army commercial or something like that.
This may surprise you, but
I'm going to skip this part, but basically it's about studying the affects of the group. Like, they put them through a bunch of different exercises where they have to feel things and simulate feelings in various ways. I'll take you straight to this part. After these exercises, then they start being connected in these kind of arrangements, various sorts.
megapixel,
yard,
gland, data inch,
tissue,
euro,
nerve, dollar,
megapixel,
yard,
gigabyte,
tissue,
euro,
nerve, dollar,
megapixel,
yard,
gland, gigabyte,
cell,
euro,
nerve, dollar,
megapixel,
yard,
gland, gigabyte,
cell,
euro,
nerve, dollar,
megapixel,
yard,
gigabyte,
cell.
So basically, I'm going to sum all of this up pretty quickly because I am probably going over time. But behind all of this discussion I just made about social reproduction is obviously also another way of describing this, which is a kind of biopolitical regime of power that I'm looking at. I'll just quickly read something, which is that I won't just read this, but basically, in a kind of, the biopolitical is the form of power that seeks to manage and look at and control life, whether it be any aspect of our lives. One of the tendencies of biopolitical regime is the need to preempt and understand the future actions of any people, of populations, of their behavior. And so a lot of this film is about future behavior and capital's increasing need to get close to and understand that behavior. So the studying of emotions is kind of accumulating into this sort of these abstract and perverse sort of forms of studying and learning about the group's mentality, their reactions. There's a lot in this film about pain and reaction to suffering, to hunger, to various things. So basically, like the very emotions that happen when a crisis takes place, or when suddenly your access to resources are curtailed, like at the present moment, and the system, the spirit is trying to learn from those things. One of the major themes going on in this film is basically the means with which capital is doing those things today. I look at computation, statistical analysis, the general use of algorithms in kind of looking at in mining and creating or accumulating data, studying it, and then learning about it. I'll just quickly read something. The advanced algorithms, they've basically been pioneered in the finance industry. Advanced algorithms scour the markets looking for automated decisions, discrepancies in statistical and correlations and arbitrage opportunities. A way of seeing an algorithm is basically it's a decision, but it's automated. It's a computer program that basically turns the decision-making capability that would normally be exercised by a human trainer into a program. And these, like an example of what these algorithms would do is they basically are like a mini kind of program trader that's set out into the markets and then scours them and makes trading decisions on behalf of people. And it's the incredible kind of accumulation of these programs right now that's creating kind of intense volatility in the market. But this same process is increasingly being applied to other areas of human, of kind of what I was calling social reproduction. In public health, it might mean tracking millions of pharmacy transactions and spotting the next outbreak of flu. Basically, it's a kind of way of bringing this tendency of the biopolitical to predict into a higher level of kind of accumulating a lot of data, whether it be from internet use and consumption. For instance, if I'm using the internet, I I buy some things, I watch some videos, all of that information is obviously being accumulated by the different sites, and then can be used to do what they call data mining, which is a kind of modeling, or kind of accumulating of that data, and then that can be then applied to models which will, or turned into models which will then give a picture of that person's behavior and also what their behavior might be in the future. Anyway, this is all a very quick explanation for things that are pretty complicated and take a while to explain. I'm going to have to finish up now, but if you're interested in seeing the film, it's popularunrest.org. It's online as well. So I should probably put it there. Okay, thanks very much.
I think, does anybody have any immediate questions? There are hands in the back.
Thank you. I was just curious, more generally, if you could speak a little about the overall aesthetic decision to try to picture finance capital through a variation on narrative film. I thought this Sam's little video was really nice insofar as it really spoke to all sorts of different logistical aesthetic difficulties and challenges in picturing finance. And likewise, in your films right there is this sort of gap between the experience of the individual wrapped in finance in some form, and then especially with this sort of like gesture towards the spirit, like, right, some gesture towards a system that almost becomes quasi-theological, which is of course like a tradition that we can trace back to Adam Smith and the invisible hand. And there's, you know, this is a constant challenge for lots of people, right, that space between the experience of the individual and picturing these, you know, vast theological systems. But could you just say a little about, you know, your decision and your approach to using narrative film, albeit one that's kind of, you know, not the traditional Hollywood type, of course, but how, you know, your strategy for picturing these sorts of issues?
Yeah. Well, in both the films I showed, but especially in Popular Unrest, what I'm trying to do is give viewers a kind of doubleness that they have to exist in, whereas they're both immersed in the actual experience of watching a film. You know, immersion being what generally has been the criticism of narrative types of conventional film. But, you know, to give the viewer an immersion at the same time as a constant need to pull back in order to understand the analysis that's actually being thrown at them. So there's always these arrivals of information that actually might be useful in a way that you have to kind of like use your intellectual faculties as well. You know, making that more explicit than, you know, normal films do that all the time, but just trying to make that even more explicit as a push and pull sort of movement that would be happening in the works. There's no hidden reason why, like, I think narrative is the specific form that needs to be adopted to deal with finance. Though actually people have been asking me that. And I know people who are writing on the subject, but I personally don't have a particular theory about that. Anyway. Just to quickly say, what the film goes on to do is just explain further why the killings are happening. And the killings are basically an expression of what I was describing and what we see every day at the moment as this deepening antagonism between capital's need to reproduce itself and the fact that it's supposed to be reproducing people on some level. You know, it's supposed to support and allow, on some level, it's supposed to allow for the life of people. And the killings are basically an expression of that. I just thought I would give you guys the ending because I had to cut it off. Enough? Is that enough?
Well, maybe we need to move on, but we'll have a break after Nathan's presentation so there'll be a chance for people to ask further questions.
Yeah, that would be great.
So we'll move on to native grant. Thank you, Melanie.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, well, thank you to Richard for arranging this event and hosting it this week, and thanks also to Sam for his invitation to speak. And thanks to everyone for being here this afternoon. My talk is called The Distribution of the Insensible. We know that Jacques Rancière speaks about the relation between politics and aesthetics in terms of the distribution of the sensible. This afternoon I want to speak about the distribution of the insensible. And I want to argue that it is the specificity of this problem which allows us to think the relation between the history of capital and the history of mimesis. Crucially, I want to show how the relation between these two histories is mediated by another, the history of technology. The relation between the history of capital and the history of mimesis is mediated by the history of technics, and it is through this history, this mediation, that art takes up techniques which throw us back outside the history of capital, outside the history of mimesis, and indeed outside the history of the human, the history of thought, and the history of sensation. Art does so within and through the technical means to which the linked histories of capital, mimesis, and technics give rise. These are my positive claims, my theses, if you will, which I eventually want to develop and illustrate through the recent work of the Montreal artist, Nicolas Bayer. But I also want to register an implicit critical dimension of my argument and of my title, a critique of Rancière and his presently immense influence, which I view as unwarranted. I can summarize this critique as follows. If Rancière were more inclined to focus his attention upon the distribution of the insensible, perhaps he might think more perspicuously not only about the relation between politics and aesthetics, but also about the relation between political economy and aesthetics, which is our focus this afternoon. That is, focusing on the specific problem of the distribution of the insensible turns out to be the key to thinking about the relation between aesthetics and politics in a materialist way, in a manner properly responsive to the exigencies of Marxist historical materialism. By way of a first approach to what I mean by the distribution of the insensible, let's recall some basic passages from Volume 1 of Capital on the topic of our symposium today, Materials and Money. Marx analyzes the process of production from two perspectives, the labor process and the valorization process. He tells us that, quote, in a famous passage, labor is, first of all, a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, controls the metabolism between himself and nature. He confronts the materials of nature as a force of nature. He sets in motion the natural forces to which belong to his own body, his arms, his legs, his head and hands, in order to appropriate the materials of nature in a form adapted to his own needs. And in this way, he simultaneously changes his own nature. Humans transform materials, and by doing so, they transform themselves. Moreover, we transform materials into tools, instruments of labor, with which we transform materials. And this is part of what changes the nature of man, according to Marx. Quote, nature becomes one of the organs of his activity, which he annexes to his own bodily organs. The earth supplies us with, quote, stones for throwing, grinding, pressing, cutting, so that the earth itself is an instrument of labor. As soon as the labor process has undergone the slightest development, Marx tells us, it, quote, requires specially prepared instruments. Thus, he writes, we find stone implements and weapons in the oldest caves. What distinguishes capitalism as a mode of production, however, is the peculiar manner in which the transformation of materials through the labor process is shadowed by the process of valorization. The transformation of materials produces objects with use value, but it also produces commodities with exchange value. Objects of utility are the bearers of value, but value is also independent of them. It is independent because the exchange value of a commodity is entirely determined, as Melanie mentioned, by the average socially necessary labor time required to produce it, not by the materials of which it is composed. Labor time is that abstract, universal equivalent, which will find its answer in the universal abstraction of the money form. And value is not a material thing, but a social relation. Thus, Marx will tell us that, quote, not an atom of matter enters into the objectivity of commodities as values. In this, it is the direct opposite of the coarsely sensuous objectivity of commodities as physical objects, unquote. We can thus view the process of production either from the perspective of the labor process or from the perspective of the valorization process. But insofar as it is specifically capitalist, what the process of production produces is value, and a particular kind of value, surplus value, and its reintegration into the production process as capital. To grasp the significance of this fact, one has to push it to its limit, as does Marx. We can view the process of production from two sides, but what it produces are commodities that are sold for money, which is reinvested in the production process and thereby becomes capital. Production produces both surplus value and capital produces extended cycles of accumulation. As Marx tells us in chapter 8 of volume 1, quote, the means of production on one hand, labor power on the other, are merely the different forms of existence which the value of the original capital assumed when it lost its monetary form and was transformed into various factors in the production process, unquote. So that is, both the means of production and labor power can be understood as different elements of capital within its own valorization process. This is what we mean when we speak of the subsumption of labor by capital. The concrete process of transforming materials through labor aided by tools is subsumed by the abstract process of valorization. So this brief summary of Marx's fundamentals is our first approach to the distribution of the insensible. The critique of political economy is bound up with the Marxist analytic of value and valorization, the production, self-presupposition, and expanded reproduction of capital that is called accumulation. With regard to the critical dimension of my argument, then, we can say first of all that the vulgar empiricism of Rancière's approach to the figure of the worker throughout his corpus proceeds exclusively from the perspective of the labor process, ignoring the valorization process. This is why Rancière is not a Marxist. He does not think the distribution of the insensible the movement of valorization, and thus he misses entirely the dimension of political economy in his thinking of politics. One consequence of this failure is that he has no rigorous means of accounting for the relation of his history of art and artistic regimes to the history of capital, to structural changes in the contradiction between capital and labor. In my opinion, this is a problem substantial enough to render his history of aesthetics somewhat less than useful. A second approach to the distribution of the insensible. In Intellectual and Manual Labor, Alfred Sohn-Rethel argues that the social abstraction of the value form and the exchange relation gives rise to our abstract forms of thought. This argument constitutes a materialist critique of Kantian idealist epistemology. For example, according to Sohn-Rethel, the purely formal character of the Kantian forms of intuition, space and time, can be understood as genetically related to the abstract formalism of the value form and the exchange relation. Time and space, he writes, are rendered abstract under the impact of commodity exchange, since, quoting Zonrethel, the exchange abstraction excludes everything that makes up history, human and even natural history. The entire empirical reality of facts, events, and description by which one moment and locality of time and space is distinguished from another is wiped out. Time and space assume thereby that character of absolute historical timelessness and universality, which must first mark the exchange abstraction as a whole and each of its features. Unquote. In Zonrethel's account, the exchange relation gives rise to a social genesis of the transcendental, the forms of intuition and categories of the understanding. And this social genesis is at once abstract and material, since the exchange value of a commodity is borne by its use value, and since exchange, like the labor process, is a physical act, but one which also requires abstraction from all physicality. That's the difficulty of understanding it. So quoting again from Zonrethel, in exchange, abstraction must be made from the physical nature of the commodities and from any changes that could occur to it. On the other hand, the act of property transfer involved in the transaction is a physical act itself, consisting of real movements of material substances through time and space. Hence, the exchange process presents a physicality of its own, so to speak, endowed with the status of a reality which is on par with the material physicality of the commodities which it excludes. Thus, the negation of the natural and material physicality constitutes the positive reality of the abstract social physicality of the exchange processes from which the network of society is woven. It's a slightly complicated passage, but the point is that in the act of exchange, the natural and material physicality of the product is negated by the abstract value of the commodity. And this negation constitutes what he calls the positive reality of the social physicality of the exchange process. So this is what Zonrethel, following Marx, calls the real abstraction of the value form as a social process of exchange. This real abstraction constitutes a kind of second nature. And Zonrethel argues that this second nature is, quote, the arsenal from which intellectual labor through the eras of commodity exchange draws its conceptual resources. We can situate this analysis more broadly at the level of the whole process of valorization, or the accumulation of capital through its circulation. The social process of valorization is the very medium in which we think, and to which thinking is applied through intellectual labor, management, for example. Insofar as intellectual labor is subsumed by capital, as is manual labor, the forms of thought themselves enter into a relation of dialectical genesis with the value form. For Zonrethel, the Kantian transcendental subject is the representative modern figure of this social dialectic, though its status as such is occluded by the idealism of Kant's transcendental philosophy. But we can also recognize today, as Catherine Malabou argues in her book, What Should We Do with Our Brain?, that there is a structural homology between post-Fordist management discourse, which emphasizes non-hierarchical networks, self-organization, flexibility, and innovation, and contemporary neurological theory, which views the brain as a decentralized network of neuronal assemblies, and which emphasizes neuronal plasticity as the ground of our cognitive flexibility and adaptation. According to Malabou, quote, neuronal functioning and the social functioning of capital interdetermine each other and mutually give each other form to the point where it is no longer possible to distinguish them, unquote. The structure of the real abstraction moves the changing structure of the contradiction between capital and labor, which is the history of capitalism, and the structure of cognition moves along with it. Such would be a historical materialist account of conceptual abstraction following from Zonrethel's critique of idealist epistemology. And so this is a second approach to the distribution of the insensible. Simply put, the way that we think, the form of thinking, is dialectically intertwined with the structure and the historical movement of capitalist accumulation. The movement of the concept is also the movement of value. Third approach. The history of modernity, which is to say the history of capitalism, is also the history of modern technology. And it goes without saying that the history of technics conditions the history of thought. We need to supplement Zone-Rethel's materialist critique of epistemology with a history of media technologies like that carried out by Friedrich Kittler, for example. And indeed, Kittler's media theoretical analysis of what he calls discourse networks should also be understood as a materialist critique of Kantian idealism. For Kittler, it is not transcendental categories, but media technologies which determine the conditions of any possible experience. Media, he argues, constitute the technological a priori of thought, sensation, communication. This is what Kittler means when he says that media determine our situation. Thus, Kittler tracks transformations of this technological a priori across epistemic shifts, determining any access to something like a history of modernity. That is to say, the conditions under which we would carry out or write such a history are media technological conditions. In what Kittler calls the discourse network of 1800, the book is the site of an encounter between reading and writing, wherein the romantic imagination produces a projection of the soul into what Novalis calls a real, visible world, which is written into and read off of printed signifiers, emerging from the text as a synesthetic and phantasmagoria in which all the senses are drawn together by the hallucinatory experience of literature, with a capital L. In the discourse network of 1900, on the other hand, gramophone, film, and typewriter affect an analytic separation of this sensory synthesis, constituting different technologies of recording and transmission for sound, the moving image, and the written word. What Kittler calls media differentiation carves up the romantic imagination, which had been sutured to the book, and parcels out its capacities among discrete technologies, addressed to a segmented perceiver, an ear, an eye, a mind, a modernist collage of the formerly integral subject. And then, in the discourse network of 2000, spawned by the cybernetic systems, information theories, and encryption technologies of World War II, digital technology draws media differentiation back together through the synthetic resources of digital code, the universal medium traversing audio, video, and textual recording. But this time the synthesis is inhuman and computational, soulless. According to Kittler, quote, the general digitization of channels and information erases the differences among individual media such that inside computers themselves, everything becomes a number, quantity without image, sound, or voice, unquote. Digital information technology destroys the image of man as the subject of knowledge and of its synthetic production. It communicates with itself through its own data channels, and consciousness becomes the epiphenomenon of communication. This, then, is the third approach to the distribution of the insensible. In a materialist inversion of the Kantian transcendental, media technologies constitute the a priori conditions of possibility for the sensible, such that the distribution of the sensible already operates under and within these conditions. Thus, Kittler can write technologies that not only subvert writing, but engulf it and carry it off along with so-called man, render their own description impossible. In possible sense, the technological a priori is itself the condition of any possible description or any sensibility. It cannot itself be described. That is to say, it is insensible. This is Kittler's transcendental argument. Media technology is the unconscious of modernity. However, to take a fourth approach, we should recognize that just as Kittler's media theory offers a necessary supplement to Zone-Rethel's account of the social genesis of conceptual abstraction, it is also necessary to submit Kittler's own work to a Marxist inversion. From the Industrial Revolution to the production and networking of digital information technologies, the history of modern technology emerges from and responds to the demands and internal contradictions of capitalist accumulation. And Marx offers the analytical resources to understand the dynamics of this history very precisely. What Marx calls formal subsumption is the initial subsumption of labor under the value form through wage labor and exploitation, the extraction of surplus value from surplus labor time. This early period of subsumption is merely formal because the process of production itself the labor process, which is subsumed, remains primarily pre-capitalist. Techniques of production are not yet specifically capitalist techniques. Thus, during the period of formal subsumption, let's say 1750 to 1850, the extraction of surplus value is primarily correlated to the length of the working day and the cost of labor power. The capitalist wants to extend the working day as much as possible and to reduce wages as much as possible. The rate of surplus value extraction depends upon these factors, and this is what's called absolute surplus value. But labor power is not only productive, it has to be reproduced, as Melanie also discussed. Workers have to rest at the end of the working day, and basically they require food and shelter. Thus, it is only possible to extend the working days so much, or to reduce wages so little, because the reproduction of capital depends upon the reproduction of labor. This is a very basic aspect of what is called the contradiction between capital and labor. This contradiction bears upon the history of technology, because it is by revolutionizing the means of production that capital attempts to overcome this initial contradiction. New technologies of production and new techniques of production, assembly lines, for example, make it possible to increase productivity and thus increase the amount of surplus value that can be extracted during a certain period of time. And thus, without further increasing the length of the working day, one can increase surplus value. So this is called relative surplus value. This is what automation and capitalist management techniques, Taylorism and Fordism, are for. What Marx calls real subsumption, let's say 1850 to 1950, is this revolutionizing of the production process such that it becomes properly capitalist. It is not only that labor is subsumed under the value form, but that the very constitution of the labor process itself changes. Importantly then, real subsumption requires and depends upon technological innovation. The capitalist process of production both needs and produces new machines because these increase productivity within a given period of time and thus compensate for limits on the length of the working day. The process of real subsumption, however, bears another contradiction. Capital invested in raw materials and the instruments of production is called constant capital in Marx. Capital invested in labor power, the labor power of workers, is called variable capital. Through the process of real subsumption, the ratio between these kinds of capital changes. Relatively more capital is invested in the instruments of labor, technology, or constant capital, and relatively less capital is invested in labor power through wages, variable capital. But Marx makes it clear that the part of capital invested in constant capital does not undergo any alteration in the process of production. That is to say, it does not increase. That's why it's called constant. The part of capital turned into labor power does, however, undergo an alteration. It reproduces its own value, and it reproduces something more, surplus value. Thus, as relatively more is invested in constant capital and relatively less is invested in variable capital, relatively less capital is available for conversion into surplus value. Capital needs to invest more in technology to increase productivity and sustain the valorization process. But by investing more in constant capital, it also decreases the amount of capital which can be converted into surplus value. Thus, due to forces of competition and technological innovation driving increased productivity, the rate of surplus value extraction tends to decline. This is what Marx calls the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. So this is a higher and more complicated form of the contradiction between capital and labor. The same process also generates a different problem. As automation increases, less labor power is required. This means fewer workers are being paid wages and for less time, and this means that less money is being paid out through the labor market for the consumption of commodities. So labor has to be reabsorbed into the labor market to support consumption and to prevent overproduction. The process of real subsumption thus also requires the growth of the tertiary service sector, which produces both new labor markets and new fields of commodity production and consumption. The new regime of accumulation that accompanies this structural transformation is what Guy Debord calls the spectacle. He summarizes its relation to the process of real subsumption in paragraph 45 of Society of the Spectacles. I'm going to quote this passage from Debord. Automation, he writes, which is at once the most advanced sector of modern industry and the epitome of its practice, confronts the world of the commodity with a contradiction that it must somehow resolve. The same technical infrastructure that is capable of abolishing labor must at the same time preserve labor as a commodity, and indeed the sole generator of commodities. If automation, or for that matter any mechanisms, even less radical ones, that can increase productivity are to be prevented from reducing socially necessary labor time to an unacceptably low level, new forms of employment have to be created. A happy solution presents itself in the growth of the tertiary or service sector in response to the immense strain on the supply lines of the army responsible for distributing and hyping the commodities of the moment. The coincidence is neat. On the one hand, the system is faced with the necessity of reintegrating newly redundant labor. On the other, the very factitiousness of the needs associated with the commodities on offer calls out a whole battery of reserve forces. So that's from before. We could rephrase this by saying more simply that Fordism both requires and paves the way for post-Fordism. Essentially, Society of the Spectacle, I would argue, is a book about the consequences of real subsumption, about the contradictions that it bears within its history, and about the new regime of accumulation necessary to defer and compensate for the crises those contradictions contain. And behind the passage I just read, we can also read a commentary on the history of technology. The development of industrial automation both necessitates and creates the conditions of possibility for the invention of new media apparatuses, especially digital information technologies and networks. These not only enable the growth of the tertiary service sector and its forms of communicative labor and consumption, but also themselves produce new markets of goods and services, and more importantly, they are the technological ground for the massive growth of speculative markets we call financialization, which is predicated in its contemporary form on the exchange of digital information. The tech boom and its implosion are the logical and necessary outcome of real subsumption, pushing beyond its limits into the society of the spectacle. So to come back to Kittler now, it is not strictly true that media determines our situation. Capital determines our situation. The conditions of possible experience are themselves conditioned by the moving contradiction between capital and labor. The history of the sensible, the transformations undergone in the media technological conditions of sensation and experience, is also the history of the insensible. The history of the process of valorization as it develops in relation to contradictions in the labor process. Shortly after he coined the term immaterial labor, Maurizio Lazzarato renounced it for the good reason that the term was impossible to reconcile with a materialist position. He should have referred instead to insensible labor. Information and cognition are not immaterial, but they are insensible. And forms of affective labor, which precisely are sensed, are premised upon the indistinction of labor and leisure, the impossibility of distinguishing them under conditions of post-Fordist accumulation. It is labor itself that becomes insensible under those conditions, dispersed into networks linking neurons and screens, and indistinguishable from the most intimate gestures of our affective lives. At the same time, however, we know that a commodity like an Apple computer is in fact produced by processes quite clearly identifiable as labor. Despite the fact that every effort is made to keep this fact out of sight and out of mind, we know it because we read about it on Apple computers. A corporation like Foxconn, the largest manufacturer of electronic components in the world, is something like a distillation of the entire history of the contradiction between capital and labor. The great movements of the Industrial Revolution, Taylorism, Fordism, the offshoring of manufacturing labor, the capitalist integration of India and China, and the simultaneity of deindustrialization and post-Fordist cognitive capitalism with the persistence of the most traditional forms of miserable factory work. Indeed, bearing the conditions of its production in mind, one might view a device like an Apple computer as a distillation of the entire history of modernity, of the manner in which modernity acts upon external nature and changes it, and in this way simultaneously changes its own nature, from the printing press to the steam engine to the silicon chip. This brings us to a fifth approach to the distribution of the insensible. Consider the images that I've been showing you of a recent installation by material artist Nicolas Bayer. The main piece is a sculptural object that we have been looking at, titled Vanitas, a reproduction of the artist's office. How was it made? Composed of aluminum, nickel, steel, glass, vinyl, and fluorescent, the production of Vanitas involves a virtuosic performance of mimetic exactitude. Every component of the artist's desk and of his tools is precisely rendered as either a three-dimensional drawing or a three-dimensional scan. Each of these objects is then reproduced at exact scale by either machining in aluminum, in the case of objects that were drawn, or stereolithography, in the case of objects that were scanned, so that's his chair. This process includes every electrical or electronic plug and cord connecting Bayer's computer, his monitors, his speakers, and his scanner. It includes the crumpled pieces of paper in his trash can and a book lying open beside his keyboard. Each of these reproduced objects is then plated in mirrored nickel before being rearranged in a reproduction of their configuration within a vitrine encased on all 6 sides in one-way mirrored glass and illuminated by overhead fluorescent light. In a dark room, the viewer looks at the object, sees into it, and sees nothing of herself, like a vampire in front of a mirror, Bayard says, while the object reflects its own interior infinitely in all directions. The first thing we might note about this piece is its complex engagement with relational aesthetics. It mimics one of the primary gestures of that movement or style, bringing the artist's studio and living space into the museum. But in doing so, it forecloses the primary content of that gesture in relational art, radically separating this space from that of the viewer, encasing it within a mise-en-abîme in which only images interact with one another. Although it draws the space within which the artist works and thinks into the space of the museum, the artist himself is conspicuously absent. The piece is something like an anti-humanist negation of relational aesthetics. Perfectly finished, enclosed, complete, pristine, it subtracts the participation of the viewer precisely through the viewer's gaze, which is drawn into and lost within the reflexive automimesis of the object. Second, we can say that Vanitas is a captivating, if we can say that Vanitas is a captivating work of art, much of what makes it so is money. Obviously, it is expensive to reproduce one's office in nickel-plated aluminum, or nickel-plated aluminum, and to display it so dramatically. A tour de force of concept, design, and execution, the piece is also nothing if not resourceful. That is, it patently shows off the artist's mastery of that form of technique so crucial to contemporary art practice, the capacity to get funding. The artist has money. His studio is something like the platonic form of so-called immaterial labor. Designer furniture and designer devices, neatly arrayed with the precision of an architectural firm, blessed with a particularly fastidious custodial staff. And the artist's work costs money. The materials, techniques, and labor required to produce it do not come cheap. Look, the piece says, money, mastery, technique, art. It is an image of capital reflected back upon itself, the mimesis of capital. The labor of the artist is the transformation of money through materials into its own image. The piece is an image of this transformation. And we should recall that this has always been the art historical function of the Vanitas. Capital circulates, but here it does so in a closed system, which is to say, it does not circulate. Rather, it reflects. At his desk, thinking, communicating, representing, the artist enters into the circuits of capital, movement of valorization, as do we all, one way or another. Now these circuits freeze. Characters and images cease to appear on the screen. No information or electricity flows through these wires. No music plays through the speakers on the desk. Digital technology has produced its own negation, precisely through its formal reproduction. The precise transformations of materials such technology enables, its retentional exactitude, or the retentional exactitude of the digital, precisely negates all transformation. We transform materials into technologies, which in turn transform materials. And here, these technologies are transformed back into materials. But this is also to transform them into an art object, neither tool nor raw material, neither instrument nor that to which it is applied. Rather, a worked form, presented, apparently useless, and withdrawn from exchange, though of course it has its uses, and it cannot help but find its way back to market. Bayer's piece instantiates the problem of the relation between materials and money captured in the art object. The content of his piece is nothing other than that relation, a reflection upon that relation. And of course, this relation has a history, which is the history of modernity. This history, too, finds itself reflected in Vanitas. The distribution of the insensible, the movement of capital, the structural transformation of the contradiction between capital and labor, the circuitous courses of the process of valorization. All this is how a digital information system ends up inside a mirrored box in the company of fluorescent lighting and minimalist furnishings installed on the distressed concrete floors of an art gallery. This movement, this transformation, this process is what we are looking at, though we cannot see it. But I want to argue that this process is also what we are looking outside of from within. Bayer's piece should be considered as part of an installation, not merely a sculptural object, insofar as it does, in fact, come into relation with its surroundings. The surroundings composed of digitally produced images and objects. Behind Vanitas, in that circle that you see on this slide, a glass reproduction of Bayer's eyeball, at the center of a projected disc of light, gazing without seeing across the room, at a mirrored box, which does not reflect its image. In front of Vanitas, a meticulously composed compound photograph of the stone wall beside the earliest cave paintings, titled Canvas. Beside Vanitas, a fond de scène, a reflector used in the background of a photo shoot, which Bayer has placed in a template with a circular hole and left in a window for 9 months. It's not a reflection of the sun, but an indexical image of its absorption, marked by the circular discoloration of the black tissue. A perfect suprematist portrait. Around the corner, a piece called Projet Étoile Noire, consisting of a graphite painting titled Monochrome Black, and a sculptural replica of a meteorite recovered from Death Valley. Having held this meteorite in the palm of my hand 3 years ago, I can testify to the strangeness of encountering its inexistence, distributed between these two art objects. As he did with the objects reproduced in Vanitas, Bayer made a three-dimensional scan of the meteorite, and then he reproduced it at a much larger scale through stereolithography. He then melted the meteorite down and used the graphite of which it was composed to paint the surface of monochrome black. The matter of the object thus remains, and so does its form, but the object itself has disappeared into an uncanny splitting of their formerly integral relation. These are photographic pieces and sculptural objects which Bayer would have worked at on the computer in the center of Vanitas. Instantiated as digital code, they were in the computer, as we say, stored in its memory banks, transformed on its screen. Now the sculptural object of the meteorite, it was transformed into, accompanies the reflective mineral simulacrum of that computer. The image has been exteriorized. We could say that it is the image of an exterior. Canvas shows us the primordial matter of mimesis, the substrate of inaugural images carved in stone, with stone, the inauguration of exteriorization. Star Black confronts us with an extraterrestrial outside, encountered, recorded, vanished, at once absent and yet uncannily present as residue and reproduction. What Bayer's installation asks us to think, however, is the manner in which it is these technologies of representation which record this outside, which draw our attention to it and make it manifest. And this suggests a sixth approach to the distribution of the insensible. Like Malick's The Tree of Life, Bayer's meteorite indexes a cosmological time and an inhuman history, which never was sensed, which was prior to sensation, prior to life, prior to thought. Though, like Malick's film, Bayer makes this history manifest through the most sophisticated technological means of representation. Bayer's canvas, recording the bare stone wall beside the first recorded images, situates this indexical effort within the whole history of representation, again, carrying us outside the history of modern techniques and of mimetic exactitude, which makes the digital rendering of this stone wall possible in the first place. At the crux of materials and money, through the complex history that crux contains, the subject of Bayer's installation is the relation between recording, mimesis, and memory. And this is why it also contains a photograph called a reminiscence. Bayer's problem is not only the remembrance of things past, but more specifically, the reminiscence of that which has never been sensed, the distribution of the insensible, recalled. At and through the limits of modernity, of capital, of mimesis, of thought, of sensation, and within their outside, his work draws us into that distribution. Thanks.
Thank you, Nathan. Does anybody have any immediate questions before we have a short break? Sound over.
So this is a little bit of a flat-footed question, but you end with that sixth model of that which has never been sensed as a model for the distribution of the insensible. But I wonder, and maybe this actually kind of goes to the question about problems of narrativization. I wonder what you think of the moment that the word insensible takes on a sort of semantic hue that seems to follow a line of meaning closer to like not making sense rather than something that is not available to sensual apprehension. That perhaps sounds to me like it could work in a sort of narrative about the dialectic of enlightenment where the role of, say, the irrational or the nonsensical in aesthetic experience is subsumed and sort of captured by the rationality of, say, enlightened modernity. Right? So the question is, how does, or do you think there's a possibility for the insensible as a descriptive term to start to enter into this sort of prescriptive terrain of the nonsensical or something that doesn't make sense?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I mean, Bayer, the work that we're seeing, I think, in a way, is kind of, in one sense, an obliteration of meaning. It shows us representations of that which existed before there was any such thing as meaning, right? And this sort of senseless time of the cosmos. At the same time, he does that through the sort of technological rationality, you might say, of the devices of reproduction that he uses. And I think that it's, part of what I'm trying to look at in this piece, right, is How it's not only that, okay, Bayer is using a computer and using sophisticated technologies to like show us that which existed before the human, right, or before sensation, and it puts his desk at the center of this exhibition to show us, look, this is where I do it, right, this is where I produce these images. But how that effort emerges out of and is inscribed within the history of capital, which, as you say, it's a nice analysis, it's precisely, as Adorno, would point out, the irrationality of capital, contradictions that I've tried to track in the paper, right? And the complete meaninglessness of the sorts of processes that, not only is attempting to narrate in your film, which is also a difficult task, right? How to narrate that which has no meaning. So it's that the senselessness of capital, the fact that it doesn't make sense, the fact that it doesn't actually work, right? Which produces the extraordinary means of rationalization at its disposal, which Adorno is analyzing. And so that kind of technical rationality that is doubled by the complete irrationality of the process which produces it, right? And that's the dialectic of enlightenment. So I think that to read, this work as a sort of writing of an outside of capital, right? The irrationality of the outside of the human, the irrationality of the cosmos, right? Something that ran through the problem of the dialectical relation between irrationality and rationality and the dialect of enlightenment. Yeah, I think that is another way to think about the distribution of the insensible, a way in which we're also learning something which doesn't make sense. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks so much. That was a great talk. I really appreciate the effort you make to point us to a history of the valorization process in capital as it bears on sensation. I totally agree with your first dig at Rancière on that score. I feel like by the end of your talk, though, I had found myself thinking more about a different history than the one you were trying to narrate by pointing us to Bayer. So I feel like, you give us in Bayer's work an example of an artist who's attempting to sort of look into the sun of capital, which is to say, to look at the thing that can't be sensed, or look at insensibility itself. But I feel like there would be another history that is the history of this sort of points of encounter, or sites of encounter, between sensation, perception, and not only insensibility in its most abstract forms, which is to say, in digital technologies, in code, and in finance, but simply in technological objects, and things that more resemble either machines that you produce things with, or vehicles of transportation, cameras even. And in a way, like, the problem I have with Bayer's work, and I think like by talking about putting it in the context of suprematism, you actually get it right. I think like the problem is that it is a bit inert, that it is very difficult to stare into the sun, and ultimately, like,
It is very well, sorry.
It is difficult to stare into the sun, It's a problem that the suprematists have as well, they're as interested in the insensibility of capitalist technology, airplanes and the like, but they have a belief at least that these could be apparatuses of perception, and they could lead to wholly new forms of perception. And I don't see that ambiguity in Bayer's work. I see more of the repetition of insensibility as an inert and ultimately inaccessible substance, if it's a substance at all. And I think you suggest it's not a substance.
Yeah.
Does that add up?
I mean, is your question, I agree with you largely in your sense of his work. I mean, if your question concerns to think about suprematism, in the moment of, let's say, 1917, Russian constructivism and the Waiting Revolution, I mean, that particular way of thinking about the relation between art and politics and technology, is one that, in my opinion, no longer really holds up. And maybe that accounts for some of the different status of the technological vis-a-vis the political in Bayer's work. Now, Bayer, I don't think of as at all a so-called political artist. I situate his work in the history of capital. It's not clear to me that that's actually what he intends. It was what he happens to have done, I think. But T.J. Clarke's book on modernism is called Farewell to an Idea. And it has that nice chapter on constructivism, partly because the idea of that rational, constructivist techno-utopia is dead and buried. We're not going to nationalize and collectivize Apple, right? So a corporation like Apple, has to be destroyed. There's no use, for such a thing in like a rational communist society that we can imagine on a global scale. This is so precisely what real subsumption means, I think, which is not complete at the moment of the Russian Revolution, at the moment of constructivism, is that well, now capitalism has actually happened, well and truly, and that means that the means of production, in my opinion, are well and truly capitalist. And when Bayer shows us this computer, it's like, this is well and truly capitalist. Look how capitalist it is, right? It's all clean and bright and pretty. And I mean, so that sort of, for me, that kind of reckoning with the fact that like technology is now capitalist technology in its essence, that's an extremely important sort of reckoning, I guess, that we have to go through, right? To acknowledge that the problem of appropriating and collectivizing the so-called means of production is not the same now as it was for constructivists. And so the outside of modernity pushes upon us in a different way. I mean, for the constructivists, they were trying to realize the project of modernity, right? Of modernization through the revolution. I don't think that's the project any longer. I don't think that's a credible project. It's a roundabout way of addressing the Thanks.
Okay, I think we might need to have a break now, and then we'll return in 15 minutes for presentations from Benjamin Lee and Craig Buckley. Thank you. Thank you, Nathan.